morning, Christina.
That's right. We have a 3-hour time difference between us.
And to anybody who's listening, wherever you are, good day or
Good
good
day,
night.
good night, good morning. Welcome back, everyone, to our podcast, Simply Human. And we're excited to have you back for this very important subject on interpersonal boundaries. So, Karen, you ready for
Boundaries.
this?
Boundaries was a tough one. It still is sometimes, guys, because that's the whole point. It's a journey for me. I'm getting better at. Just because I'm on a podcast talking about it doesn't mean I can feel like Christina's a lot further than I am. But this is why we bring it to you guys, because it's an important thing to learn. And we're all in different journeys on different topics. Because even when we do these podcasts again, it's so exciting to do with these things that as humans, we have to do these things. So excited to explore the word because honestly, it was a trigger word, an internal trigger word for me. Like you just saw me when you see boundaries. I don't know if you could tell, but I was getting a little bit tense there because it's still like, oh, so keep working on. But it's a hard thing for me. So
Yeah, I don't think you're alone in feeling that way. The reason I want to do this topic is because it is such a consistent issue that comes up with almost every single client that I have. And as we're going, and I can tell that there's an issue here around boundaries, and I'll say, so, how are you with boundaries? And they'll have the exact same reaction that you just had. Boundaries was also something really difficult for me. And it was quite a long journey, years actually, for me to start understanding it, learning how to do it, being consistent, and then being comfortable where now it's second nature. And I think there's an aspect where you and I were born in the mid 60s, raised, kids in the 70s, that we weren't taught, certainly as girls, but as children, this wasn't something you taught your kids is about boundaries. I think current generations and current parents are a lot better about teaching their kids, particularly their girls, about boundaries. But there's still a lot of adults out there who struggle, just like you described, just as my journey has been. So that's why I felt this is a really important subject for us to go to. I was wondering if you could share a little bit about your own experience with boundaries in your life or the struggle that you had.
I think it's very interesting because boundaries never really hit me until I actually got married. Because when I grew up, my parents and I were so close. In many ways, I feel as though when I got married, I put my mother inside my family unit. And then we struggled. So that's when I realized about boundaries more so than anything else. Because it was important that Mark and I, especially when we had our daughter, Michelle, that it wasn't Mark, Michelle, my mom, and me. Right? And I did not realize how much that created that I had to create a boundary because she was so instrumental in my life. It felt wrong to put her outside of my life, but I
Mm,
didn't realize, right? To physically think that she couldn't be in my life, I couldn't understand that. I couldn't understand what a boundary meant. I think that's where I really began to struggle. And then when I had fibromyalgia at one point in my life, I know that it became apparent that all the stress of having my mother in that, as well as everything else going with not liking my job or who I was, all is bundled in that. But I think the key thing I wanted to say, that's when I first realized I had to, because it was something that I had to maintain my self health.
mm.
Because if I don't have boundaries, it puts people in there or allows people to deter me to the point where I don't know how to make decisions and all these other things. Does that
Yeah,
does that make sense?
absolutely. Yeah.
I think that's when it really hit hard. And that was my wake up call where I had to redefine the relationship between my mom and I because I was married and I had a child and there was too much strife related to it, her being inside.
Do you feel that there was a cultural aspect then for you?
I think it was a cultural aspect, but I'm not so sure it's purely cultural. I just think because my mom and I are really good friends. I shouldn't say good friend. I don't know. We were really close. We'll put it that way. I lived such a good life up until I hate when I say this. I don't want people get the wrong here. It's like I lived a good childhood. Like I didn't have to worry, and so I lived a life when I had to take over my financial and had to be like the main breadwinner because of our family when we made certain decisions. It created havoc in my life. It redefined things that made it harder where that my mom and our relationship had to be different because my mom told me I would do. But the problem is that whatever I would do, I never like talked to Mark about it sometimes. And that's not right when you're in a marriage. But I wasn't used to it. And so then I realized the importance of that, about boundaries, and no, talk to my mom about this situation. Like my financial situation was none of my parents' business. And that's what Mark could tell me. But I talk to financial with my parents all the time. So that's what I mean. Like you have to set up some boundaries and redefine them as you enter different stages in life.
Yeah, yeah. I know that there are some cultures where that closeness in family is part of the cultural norms. And
Yeah.
so, partly where we're coming from, we're in the United States. So, we are speaking a little bit with a cultural bias on this Western culture. For me, I don't even think I knew what boundaries were, to be honest with you. And I didn't really recognize that there was this adverse impact until college, where I got into my very first relationship. I was pretty naive, and it was with somebody who really didn't have any respect for boundaries. And not knowing that I had a choice or I can say anything, I would say that it was a very emotionally abusive relationship. And it was only until it became physically, like it shoved me against the wall. Like I knew that was wrong, but everything else that had happened, he was really good at making it feel like it was my fault. Say if we were at a party in college and I'd be ready to go, and his comment would be like, don't be controlling. So the message to me was, if you have a need and express it, you're being controlling.
Oh,
Yeah.
wow. Okay.
And then that sort of set me up for when I got married. And that first relationship, I had trauma from it. I started therapy. I started learning about needs, and that I had the right to have needs. And I started to try to assert it. Then my husband would say, you're being selfish. So then I equated having needs now. Oh, apparently it's not controlling, it's being selfish. So I had to work through all of these challenges to just having these healthy boundaries, because the messaging was, you shouldn't be having needs. You shouldn't be communicating these things. Yet you have to know what your needs are in order to even begin to have boundaries. And you have to believe that you have the right to have these needs, and you have the right to know what's okay for you and what's not okay for you, in order to even start getting into the practice of living a well boundaried life. I would say it took me a good 5 years in therapy to really start to understand how to do this well. So I want people to understand that don't feel bad if you struggle with this. We all struggle. This is hard. And that's why we wanted to do this more of an in depth look at boundaries and break it down into something more operational. For those of you who are on the YouTube channel, or I have slides, but if you're listening on a podcast, we're just going to try to read to you what I have here. And part of it is we want to make sure that people understand like why we need boundaries. Karen, I mean, in your life, what have you discovered? Is there anything else that you've discovered in your own life, like why it's so important, like in your professional life, perhaps?
I just think it's important to have boundaries so you don't lose yourself. I
Mhm.
think boundaries are an important part of imposter syndrome too, because I feel like if you don't have boundaries, that's how you lose yourself in the masking and all these other things. But again, boundaries tend to be more of discovery. I'm peeling the onions more about it because I think you start to learn the boundaries that you need as time goes on. And also saying a little bit about too is this is a simply human topic for us because of the fact that some of this is you don't want to have boundaries because you don't want to be outside that tribe. You want to belong. But that's why for me, if I have a boundary, I feel like people won't like me. I gotta realize that the boundaries are important because it helps me be a better person of who I really am. And I have just more joy in my life. So I'm not rethinking about, oh, I should have done this, I should have done this, or I wish I didn't do this. That's why I think boundaries are as important.
Yeah, what I want people to understand is boundaries. First of all, we're going to have to maybe give you a different definition of what boundaries are, because when I ask clients, what is your concept of what boundaries are? Because we hear it all the time. You should have good boundaries, blah, blah, blah. What is your understanding of what boundaries are? And you'll see a little bit of a like, oh, shoot. I'm going to have
Why
to.
did she ask me that question? Because I don't like what is the definition? I'm not so sure I even know. How would you define? You did a very succinct way. So I'd love to hear what your definition is.
Yeah, well, a lot of people generally say boundaries are walls, they're barriers, or sometimes they have one aspect of boundaries. It's what's okay and what's not okay.
Mhm.
And that's part of it. But I don't want you to think about boundaries as walls, because that's one of the things that keeps people from learning about boundaries or putting the energy into asserting boundaries, because they feel like a boundary keeps them separate from other people. Because you think about a wall, that's what you're thinking. I was thinking about other ways to define boundaries, and a synonym or another word for boundaries is demarcation, like what marks you versus the external world. Where I learned this model was this really great book that's unfortunately out of print. You can get it if it's in a used bookstore, but it's called Personal Power, an Unorthodox Guide to Success by H.B. Park. And his definition was boundaries are I boundaries. So they define who you are as a unique human being.
Oh,
So
I like that.
it's
I about
beautiful. It's beautiful,
yeah.
really. And it's a combination of your values, of your preferences. That's the what's okay, what's not okay. And it allows you to be in a world and what makes you distinct from somebody else. And when you said earlier, well, one of the problems, like it helps me not lose myself, that when you have permeable boundaries where it's not clear yet, you can kind of get lost in another person and you lose a sense of self, versus if you have clear boundaries, you can make this really beautiful contact. And that contact is what creates a sense of intimacy and safety and connection. So it's the opposite of walls and this idea of keeping people out. It's actually something that allows people to say, I know who you are and I know where you're coming from. And this is who I am and this is where I'm coming from. And now let's figure out where those connection points are. So it's what creates healthy relationships.
But I love what you said about connection points because I do agree, and I think it's how you show respect to different people because we're all different. We're similar, but we're also different.
It's absolutely how you are able to engage respectfully with other people.
Exactly.
Absolutely. What I'd like to do is operationalize this, because while people maybe have that initial piece, it's what's okay, what's not okay. What happens is that's all that they have typically. It's a three-legged stool to have really effective boundaries, and that's only one leg, knowing what's okay, what's not okay. And you have to have two other legs. You need to know what's okay and what's not okay. You need to identify what is actually in your control. And then you have to identify what you're actually willing to put some energy or action into executing. And you have to have all three of those legs. And let me explain what happens when you don't have all three of those legs. And this is where I find most people get confused, because what happens is they will only have one leg of the stool.
Which is
And then
the first one is usually the one that I know that I kind of know, but exactly. Or one and two. I don't always have three. I think that was my problem. Yeah. The third one's about what action I would do. Oh, geez.
right. Let me give you a common example of what I hear is a person say they only have one leg. They know what's okay and what's not okay. This is a situation that comes up a lot, and that's a conflict, particularly in a relationship, but it could happen in the workplace. It could happen with a friend, where the conflict starts to escalate and there's disrespectful language or even name calling or yelling. They know it's not okay. And what they'll say is, you can't speak to me that way. Or they'll come to therapy and say they were disrespecting my boundaries because I told them it wasn't okay to talk to me. But that's it. That's the only thing. They said, this is what's okay, this is what's not okay. But you can see that they didn't identify what was in their control, and there's no action in that. They're completely dependent on the other person cooperating. It's how the other person behaves. Well, when you only know what's okay and not okay, and you're not taking action and you're dependent on the other person, you're really wishing. You're wishing and hoping. And wishing and hoping is not the same as a boundary. So the other problem I see is maybe they have two legs. So they'll say, it's not okay to yell at me that way. And they feel like, okay, well, I'm willing to, what I have in my control is I can make a request. I can say, will you stop speaking to me that way? but there's still not an identification of what's in their control. So there's still a dependency on the other person being cooperative. And they'll come and say, like, this was me when I first started learning boundaries. I only had the first two. I would know what was okay, and then I would communicate it. And my expectation was, well, I communicated it, so now those boundaries should be respected. And it wasn't. I was told I was selfish. So to have really effective boundaries, and now this is a combination of Karp's work and the love and logic parenting strategies, which is a wonderful approach to parenting that is focused on having really positive relationships with your kids and focusing on healthy, compassionate boundaries. And that would sound like, it's not okay to yell at me. I'm going to think about what's in my control. And what's in my control is whether I'm going to stay engaged in that conversation. And the action I'm willing to take is I'm willing to leave the room. So it sounds a little bit more like, I'm only willing to have this discussion when you can speak respectfully. And if you can't, I'm going to go take the dog for a walk and I'll be back in 30 minutes. Let's cool down and we can try again. And now you're able to remove yourself from that situation because you've empowered yourself and you're not just hoping and wishing that the other person will cooperate. Now, in relationships, we often are in that two-legged situation where we don't have control. We are in requests. In most healthy relationships, we're making requests back and forth of each other. And then hopefully we're negotiating some sort of compromise or, okay, yeah, I can do this for you. I would need this. That is going to be the majority of the relationships. That's not where the problem is. The problem is when you actually need a boundary, but you're only operating in requests. And then you're feeling frustrated, you're feeling disrespected, you're feeling powerless. These are the signs, some of the signs that you're in a situation where you probably need to stop and think about, what do my boundaries need to be? And one of the things I always tell my clients is a sure sign that there's a need for boundaries is that you're feeling resentment. So I don't know.
Oh, I love that.
So I just want to bring you back into the screen.
Yeah. Just so you guys know, I went into a coughing fit. So that's when I was trying to like move to figure out how to change the layout for a bit. But that's what I love when you said that, because I think that's the thing is, so when you talk about resentment, so let's clarify what you meant by resentment. So resentment is when you actually have something bubble up, right? And how would you define
There's
resentment in your terms?
there's usually an internal dialogue that the other person should have done something. There's
Oh,
some
okay. Got
unmet
it.
expectation and a feeling of grievance. There's a grievance that makes you feel negatively. Resentment is your friend. If you're just learning about boundaries and you find yourself experiencing resentment, that it becomes your friend of saying, stop, take a moment. Did you say yes to something that was not okay? Are you relying on cooperation and you're not getting it, but you didn't do something that you needed to do? You really needed a boundary in that place because you will feel resentment. So when I was learning to get more consistent with boundaries, I noticed, because I'm a helper type.
Me too.
I'm a helper without thinking.
Yeah, me too.
And then maybe be exhausted and then,
Yes. I'm saying yes to everything,
yeah,
which is not a healthy thing to do when you're a pleaser, right? And
right.
having boundaries would be helpful because I would start to learn how to say no to things, right? By having a boundary or set a boundaries,
Yeah,
correct?
and we'll get into some of the reasons that get in the way, but if you're a helper type, it feels hard to say no because you're afraid of disappointing somebody, or
Exactly.
you're feeling selfish, you're selfish, or all of these things that says you have to be giving, 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 but then your battery is draining, and then that resentment starts to rise. Why are they still asking? Why is everyone putting this on me? Right? It's a very you listen to yourself and it's very passive. It's a very passive position. So I can give some examples of where you might be making requests.
I love that. The difference between, yeah, I love that.
So say and this comes a little bit from working with different people. You tell your boss that during an interview that work-life balance is a core value, and they tell you, oh yeah, our company has that same value. But over time, your plate just keeps getting more and more piled up and piled up. You ask for more help, you're promised help, but nothing ever manifests. And you just keep waiting for them to act on
That
the,
promise that they
that
made you,
promise. Yeah.
that
So,
expectation. Yeah.
so you put the request out and you've said what the need is, but you haven't realized, like, can you say no? Can you say my plate is full? Can you go back and say, hey, we had a conversation when you
Yeah.
hired me, and now I'm doing my work and Johnny's work over here, and I'm burning out, and then you promised help and you didn't give it. Where you might have to do confrontation. Maybe the action is confrontation, and that's going to be another issue. We have another episode on that. But there are barriers to it, but you have to start recognizing, I can't just say that work-life balance is a value. I get this a lot. People saying, I want to have boundaries around work-life balance, but they're not clear at all what's in their control or what action they can take. So that's a place where they're really stuck in wishing. This is why it's so important to at least know what those boundaries need to be, because boundaries are most effective and the easiest to do when you set them up front, because what you're doing is expectation setting up front. So it's always going to feel more difficult for those who aren't comfortable with what feels like conflict if they aren't communicating up front. Like, I can take this on short term, but what's the plan
Oh,
for
I like that.
you
Yes,
do it up
that's
front.
brilliant.
So you don't, you just take it on, and then you're starting to burn out and that resentment's coming up, and now you feel, oh, I have to go talk to them, but now I'm full of resentment and I'm annoyed and they're not treating us well. Then it's going to feel like you have to have conflict in order to assert your boundaries. So it's so much easier when you start that up front, like, yeah, we can all do this, but it's short term, right? What's the plan? Let's have a plan for how long this is going to go on. What's the expectation? This is what I can do. This is what I can't do. This is my expectation. Let's revisit it in a month and see where we're going on refilling that position, right? You do all of that up front, and then it's just having normal conversations as a team. It's not feeling like you have to have a confrontation. Parenting is another place. And again, I recommend the Love and Logic Parenting. They have a website. I highly recommend downloading the audio, because we need to hear the tone in which boundaries are communicated. That's another really important component, where the tone, especially when you do it up front, it's very collaborative, because you're just sharing who you are and being honest and looking for, where can I meet this person, as opposed to trying to assert the boundary after the fact, after you're already annoyed and resentful. So with kids, like, I get these sorts of examples a lot. Might be, you let your kid drive your car, but you say you have to be responsible and you have to fill up the tank when you bring the car home, and the kid keeps forgetting despite your frequent reminders, and you keep requesting and you keep requesting every time they borrow the car, and then they'll come and say, my kids are disrespecting the boundaries. I was like, okay, they disrespected your request, but
But there's no consequence,
what
right?
action did you take? And they'll be like, they hadn't thought yet about what the action needs to be. I'm like, well, you could just say, sorry, you can't drive the car, because they haven't, that was the consequence. Sometimes the action is the consequence. You have the ability to do that. And you deliver it with empathy. Like, I know that's been really helpful for you, the car, but can't seem to just be respectful of our expectations. So you lost that privilege. Now I have parents who will say, oh, but if I do that, then I have to chaperone them, or not chaperone. I have to chauffeur them. I have to
So
chauffeur
for, yeah,
them.
exactly. Yeah.
So then they're bearing the consequence. And I'm like, you know what? I don't know. I again grew up in the 70s and 80s. We walked, we rode our bike. Somebody else's mom drove us, like, you had to think about what to do to resolve this for yourself. A lot of parents these days feel they automatically have to jump in and do that helicopter parent, instead of letting the kids sit with the consequence in the experience of what real boundaries are, so they can learn that lesson. and problem solve for themselves. So I'll be like, well, that sounds like a request. Yes, you're doing a terrible job getting your you're not negotiating really well with that. So those are just some examples how in the work environment, with your kids and in interpersonal relationship, we really need to do boundaries all the time,
And you
right?
know how much I love about I love how we're tying the requests, but and the points of the consequences. And I also think that the more specific we are about the request,
Mhm.
the better off we are. Just generically, because we tend to say a little bit, we expect people to read our minds. Instead of being very specific, it's like almost like smart goals. So you have
Yes.
there's like a way to do smart goals. There's ways to do the requests that are very specific, and there's a way to create your boundaries very specific. The more specific you are, and don't assume they know, you better tell more than less. Is what I'm learning also, and remembering a lot more about requests.
Yeah, and if people aren't familiar with SMART goals, it's an acronym and it stands for specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time based. So there's
Time bound, right?
some sort of deadline. If
Hmm.
that would be so helpful when you're communicating your request and, hey, I need it by X date, and will you agree? This is when you're negotiating. Let me know a day before if there's some challenge to actually getting it done so I can go figure out some workaround instead of waiting until after it's due and they're like, oh, I couldn't get to it. Now you've really kind of left that person. So when you're communicating boundaries, some of those aspects of SMART goals, yeah, to have really clear expectations.
Yeah.
So there are some ways, in addition to noticing resentment, that will be warning signs that you can use to notice if you're in a moment where you need to stop and say, do I need boundaries here? So there's resentment, but there's also other emotions. You might feel anxiety. You might feel sort of a helpless or hopeless despair, might feel burned out. You might notice yourself complaining and having a bit of a victim story. A victim story you'll often hear with people who have poor boundaries. And these are some of the struggles. Your health, you might be carrying a lot more stress and burnout and actually have stomach aches. You might have a lot of body tension. You might not be sleeping well because you're exhausted because you haven't said no or you haven't figured out how to have those boundaries you need for your own time and your own balance in your life. So these are all things that are important to start noticing. Am I chronically in a mood of resentment? Am I chronically exhausted? Am I a helper type and I feel like I'm giving, and I'm not getting replenished? Those are all some signs you can look for to say, okay, let me go and re listen to this podcast and think about the three legged stool and try to identify what's okay, not okay, what's in my control, and what action can I take. Go ahead.
I no, I think we're saying a lot about when you're talking. I think about this, where I think you have to remember boundary isn't all about all or nothing. Like, it could be around a certain person that you have a boundary. It could be like this one person because of the way our personalities gel or whatever. That I have a boundary about something with them because they tend to be the certain type of person who's always asking me to do things because they could count on me and I need to say no to them. So it doesn't have to be every single, like I don't have to categorize this all the time. I'm this way. And I think that's what I'm starting to understand about when we're talking now is it could be an individual response that I start to have a boundary around. When you think about it with one person, it's good because it also ties to values and some other things that we were talking about.
What I hear you saying is you maybe need to think about it's not just about you, it may change with different people in your life. That's what I hear you saying, that there's some people who you have to be more alert, and there's some people who are basically, it's safe to be in requests.
Yeah, I think I have feel like sometimes I have to protect myself as a boundary. I create a boundary to protect myself. Like when you have someone who's a narcissist. Seriously, right? And there's certain ways I have to protect myself. I don't even see them as that 'cause I'm just so positive intention, positive, right? And then I realize, I got to start to create some boundary because it's starting to feel this like, I don't know. But I think that's the thing I like about this is it's like we are just talking earlier. This is hard for me because I think again you're unpeeling the onion of yourself that you're learning more and more. And I love this why you just said it's again, guys, remember it's like what your body is trying to tell you. We're
Mhm.
becoming more aware of it. And you ask yourself, is this a resentment? And then this is where I have to create a boundary. So there's a lot of things that we're asking you to have some insights and give you some tools as a way to think about, is there a boundary here that I need? So that's what I love about what you're doing today. Because even some of the tools you gave today, I wasn't thinking about, and I'm expanding my ability to learn more about boundaries as well. So I thank you for that as well.
Well, I'll give you an example of what you were just saying about with people, with certain people, we might have to be more mindful, more alert. And when you and I worked together, I had just started working with the company and I got put on a virtual team. So I didn't actually work with you and the other people in that group. I had to work with people who were all over the country. And the person who brought me in was a director.
Hmm.
I was pretty early and just barely starting to learn about boundaries. I'm talking a few months into learning about boundaries.
Mm.
And I think he had a crush on me in retrospect. You know, with my Asperger's, I'm not that great at picking some things up, but I just noticed that his conversation was getting more and more inappropriate
Mm.
and making me uncomfortable. Talking about, like, sexual things that, weird, yeah, with,
Wow.
like, his wife or it was really weird, and I was getting uncomfortable, and thank goodness I was in graduate school at that time, and I was in a class with a bunch of people who were in the HR department in their companies, and
And you could share.
I
Yeah.
shared, and they said, "Christina, that's sexual harassment."
Ah.
And I was like, "Is it?" They're like, "Well, do you feel comfortable saying anything?" And I did. I was scared. I was like, "No one knows me in this group." Some of the conversations he would bad talking another female employee, like kind of regularly. And I kept thinking, gosh, if I offend him and no one knows me, he's going to go start telling everybody what a
Yeah.
terrible employee I am.
And
So
I'll
I
be the black sheep, right?
Oh, yeah,
Like nobody
I had
wants to work with.
so much anxiety and I couldn't sleep, and so when they said, "This is what it is," I went and talked to the team leader who I had been well, he had actually left the company just weeks after I joined, so he wasn't in the company. I felt actually safer. I
Mm.
contacted him, had lunch, and it helped a little bit because he said, yeah, there's been some suspicious stuff with that person," and he encouraged me to talk to this other director. Because
Ah.
he had to Harry, who
Uh-huh.
had experience in HR and could help me navigate it. So I decided, let me go talk to Harry. But I had all of that. Oh, I don't want to get someone in trouble. What if I'm misunderstanding? There's a lot of that guilt and anxiety and worry. And what I realized was I don't feel I could take action because I don't think the environment is safe yet for me to do that. So by telling Harry what was going on, he said, we really should go to HR about with this, but I want you to be able to make the decision. And I decided, let me first I told him, I don't think I've set a clear boundary yet because I was afraid to. But now that you know what's going on, let me go try to set that boundary and see if I can handle this. So the next time he came, I said, this is not okay. I don't want you, and I made my request. I don't want you to, I was willing to put that action and to bring it up with him. And then I was also very clear that I was willing to go to HR. Yeah, I said, "This is not okay, and you're making me uncomfortable. And if you don't stop, I'm going to have to go to HR and file a complaint." And yeah, that boundary was really effective. And he really backed off and he didn't do any of the things I feared. But even if he had tried, I had set it up so that I felt safe. So there are things
Because you
that
had HR, because you had Harry there who
he had
heard the
to,
story. So I
yeah.
think that's the whole story. You don't necessarily say that. Sometimes you need to make sure that you have your backup in place before you say it, because that's
Yeah, so you can see what I was doing was I recognized that I wasn't taking action. Why wasn't I? Because it didn't feel safe. I had to evaluate that. And then I realized that was a problem. How do I shore that up? Let me see if I can make it safer by talking to another director about what I'm struggling with so that if there is backlash, they will know.
hmm, don't know the truth, that it's not
I
like,
will
yeah,
have that support. Yeah.
exactly, exactly.
And then let me go. Now I feel safe. I've got my ducks in a row. Now I can go. So, folks, what I'm saying is sometimes in these really difficult situations, you do have to think about it and you might have to do some preliminary steps. You might have to talk to some people to get the support that you need. It sometimes it's going to be in the moment, it's just you and your spouse. Sometimes in a work environment, it's going to be really different. You have to find that trusted person. This is why I'm saying that boundaries, you hear it all the time in self-help and these,
It's hard though.
I don't
Yeah.
know what you call these things that come up on like Instagram and motivational quotes.
Mhm.
As if it's the easiest thing in the whole wide world. It is not the easiest thing. It takes practice, it takes insight, it takes understanding what your needs and your values are, it takes support, it takes practice, and giving yourself permission to do that for yourself for your own health. But there's a lot of things that get in the way of doing all of those things. I want to just go over real quickly what are some of those things? Like I mentioned some of them that the environment wasn't safe,
Right.
right? In that when I had to actually address the safety of it. That might be cultural, like we mentioned earlier. It may not be the cultural norm
Mhm.
to tell your mother that she can't be sticking her nose in your
Yeah,
business.
that was really hard for me. Yeah.
Yeah, and that might be something you
She
see
thought
this
I was being
in.
disrespectful of her being my elder,
Right, right.
and so I had to find the right way to say. I never told her. I have to remember, I did not tell her you're no longer a part of my family. I just have to act differently too. I
Yeah,
didn't tell her anything directly. I realized it was how I had the choice
yes.
on her impact on my decisions or things. So that's where I switched. She didn't need to change. I had to change the way I was putting her into my decision making and stuff. So I think that was where it was different. So
But that's exactly what we just talked about, Karen. Instead of thinking about, "Oh, I have to tell her something and then have her cooperate,"
right,
it was, "Let me think about what's in my control. Oh, I can choose not to share certain things.
exactly. Like
That's
don't
how I'm
tell her
gonna
my
have this
financial
boundary."
stuff.
Yeah, yeah, but you see, having boundaries, it's really an empowered experience because of this focus on what's within your control. That is
Yeah.
one of the legs that's always missing for people, that identification of what's in my control, and that's where we can feel empowered. Thinking of that way, that I'm responsible for my boundaries, I have to think of what's in control. Getting over fear of conflict, getting over fear of looking at boundaries as I'm disappointing somebody if I'm being selfish. There might be a power difference. Like my situation, there was a power difference because I was dealing with a director and I'm a brand new employee. So that could be a challenge. You have to work through that. Maybe you don't have the skill. You know you need a boundary, you don't know how, and this is why you then go to a coach, go to someone who's really good with boundaries. I have a friend who I keep telling her, I gotta bring you to where I live to come visit and just do a talk on boundaries because she's just the queen of boundaries. She's so skillful at it that I use her as an example a lot. It's just how she lives. She says, I never do anything I don't want to do. That's just my fundamental philosophy in life. I don't say
Wow,
yes to
that's
things I
very
don't want to do.
powerful. Right, right. Well, I'm sort of like doing that too. With I think that's the whole point. Is I don't regret. I'm making sure that yeah, I kind of like that. I like that.
Yeah, that if you have regret, you're probably doing something you don't want to do.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
that's right. And then I think being open to have those conversations, the importance of dialogue.
yeah.
Right. I know that's something that you really value.
Yeah. I think also what I was thinking about too with the thing is that remember it doesn't have to be also to be in the moment. When I have this conversation and then I think about it afterwards, then I say next time. Right? So next time let me do it this way. And that's what I think is the beauty of this is I tend to beat myself up because I didn't do this. Like I should have set a boundary. But at
Yeah.
that time it just didn't happen. And so we also don't want you to beat yourself up and say, oh, I should have, I should have. What I say now is next time I will, because you're preparing yourself for the next time. That's what's powerful too, because I see myself that I should have said no, but now I realize, so I have to explore that more about it. Imagine what I would say again if this happened again, and then I prepare myself for the next. So this is also, I want you guys to remember that too. It's not like you got to remember all three steps right away. You got to practice it, right? And so it could be a past thing where you say, next time I will do this. You're looking back at that scenario, then you practice and you think about what you would say. So that's just something I want to put out to everybody as well.
And you can always go back if you've had time to reflect and maybe you said yes to something and you're feeling resentment and you stop and you think about it. There's a lot of integrity to go back and say, I've had some time to think about this and I'm realizing that I was in my habit of saying yes and I'm overextending myself and I want to help you. But the reality is, I don't think I can do that without feeling resentment or without burning myself out. Whatever the adverse consequence is, can I help you think about other options, participate in helping that person find the workaround? But what you're building over time is trust. Trusting yourself because you're going to, even if you didn't do it in the moment, you will go back and clean up the mess and stand up for yourself, or you're also building trust with the people around you because your yes means yes and your no means no. Like that's one of the signs of someone who has good boundaries. Someone has those good boundaries when they offer to do something, you feel really okay accepting it because you know that if they didn't want to, they would say no.
I think what's exciting about this, guys, too, and I want to close because I know we're coming to time. So, Christine, if you were to really focus on what you really want to leave with people about boundaries, and this is Boundaries 101, guys, because we'll probably come back to this topic again to go deeper into it. So, love to hear your thoughts and comments about what else questions you have about boundaries. How would you want to leave us with? What would you want to leave us with on the topic of boundaries?
What I want people to hopefully take away from this is to understand that this model of boundaries, that there are three components that you have to have in your mind if you feel the situation is calling for boundaries. Again, not all situations that's in the forefront. There's a lot in your life, in your relationships, you're dealing in mutual requests and just good communication about communicating your needs and seeing if the person
Yeah.
can meet them. But there's things that are just not in your control. And when you're in those situations and you are dependent on someone's cooperation, then you're really in the realm of learning really good sort of negotiation and persuasion skills. And that's a whole different topic. But if you feel that you're in a situation because you're noticing resentment, you're noticing feeling overwhelmed, that, maybe I need to have some boundaries, then you think about the three legs of the stool. What's okay? What's not okay? What do I need? What do I not need? What's in my control? And what actions do I need to take that of the things that are in my control? To also think about boundaries early, early in the process and not at the end. You will find it is so much easier when you have those conversations up front. Get support because sometimes you need support to feel safe or to have that courage that you need to talk it through with somebody first to make sure the situation is going to be productive. Communicate boundaries with compassion and kindness. Your tone matters. And you understand as you start to get better at boundaries, it is an act of self compassion. And so that you feel that you're being kind to yourself, and then you can be communicate it kindly. Sometimes I have to be assertive though. If someone is really being disrespectful, I'm kind to myself, but firm with the other person. So
Mm.
thinking about the tone, what's the appropriate tone? And then understanding that boundaries are not walls, that the clearer your sense of who you are as a unique individual, as distinct from everybody else in your life and the environment, the more connected you can actually be. People know where you stand, they know what your values are, they know how you want to be treated and how you don't want to be treated. And you can cultivate these relationships and cut out relationships that are just consistently disrespectful of your boundaries. You can now make that choice for yourself because you've done your work, and that it's so worth the time and the effort. That I hope that this is something that you have in your life that you need to work on, that you can jot down some notes on this. And if you have a therapist, you have a coach, you have someone you can go to, get someone in your corner to help you with this. So that's what I would leave you all with. Karen, anything
Thank
last word for you?
you. No, I just am excited because I've learned some new things, and I was reminded again of the stool because you brought that up before. And guys, I really think that that's important. And so I would even ask with you to even take what she wrote and maybe do it on a three, an index cards. Then you have it available or on your phone or something, so you could think about it with the three-legged stool and the three different steps, because it's very important. I mean, I think that's again how we maintain that healthy self, the
Yeah,
healthy
and I'll have a link
ego.
to this,
Yeah.
the presentation. I'll have a
Yeah.
link to this.
Oh,
So
on your
for those,
site. That's right. Your site has that because you did it over the
yeah, I
yeah,
have this up
great.
on my website. I have the
Yep.
full presentation. So if you're on the podcast, I will go make sure to put the link in the program notes. And if you're on YouTube, we'll have a link down in the description so you can have access to this presentation and have that to remind yourself and work through it. So I hope this was helpful for everybody. If it was, please leave us a comment. Let us know if there's even deeper levels or specific areas where you'd like us to come back and do more specific on certain situational boundaries. We'd be more than happy to do that. Hit likes, hit subscribe, hit those notifications, and thank you so much for joining us.
Until
Bye,
next time,
everybody.
guys.